So welcome to the final sort of substantive session, and I have to say it's a testimony, I think, to the dedication of this audience to Latin American issues that on a Friday there are still so many people in the room, and including, I think, even some from the Navy, as was mentioned earlier, so they're giving up their spare time to us, which we really appreciate. I'm Neil Melvin. I'm the director of the International Security Studies team at RUSI. And what we wanted to do in this final session is really come back, I think, to the points we were making at the beginning of the whole conference, which is today's event is the first in what we hope is going to be a growing sort of intensity of engagement by RUSI with our Latin American partners on these security and defense issues. So we're ending today's conference, but we now want to look ahead to what we're going to be doing in the next year, and in particular to the next conference, reflect, I think, a bit on some of the issues and themes that have come out of today's conversation, and to try and identify some of the priorities. And we could think of, I think, no one better than Professor Laurence Whitehead to join us for these reflections, someone who's had a decades-long engagement in Latin America and really sort of unrivaled expertise based at the University of Oxford at Nuffield College, but also working at Oxford Analytica, so also very much engaged in the practical, analytical, and policy issues. So I thought we'll take a sort of I'll ask Laurence just to reflect a little bit on what he thinks are the key issues coming out of today's discussions, and then you can't all relax yet. You have a little bit more work to do. If any of you have any other reflections to add into that, and I think this is really going back to Fiona Clowder's sort of challenge to us now, which is how do we take all of this and build a practical engagement that starts to address this mythical hierarchy in the Foreign Office. How do we get Latin America a bit higher up that list of conversations that the new minister gets briefed on? What are going to be the questions? So Laurence, I mean, we've covered an enormous amount of ground today. I mean, it's been a very, very rich discussion, a lot of very interesting comments. I mean, what is your sense of where we are now with Latin American security? Are we sort of seeing a continuation of traditional issues that have sort of evolved and so on, or are we actually looking at a potential shift in which the geopolitical dimension is going to become much more important, maybe engage in these the regional questions, and perhaps begin to see more like a transformation on the security side?
Yes. Well, thank you very much. Thanks, RUSI. I'm delighted that RUSI's devoted these resources and promoted what's been a very stimulating day with 15 excellent presentations. So I can't do justice to all of them. I mean, on the question of security, I think what's come out from the panels is that this is a multifaceted, there is geopolitical security, there is military and standard conventional security, and this is important. But we've also heard that the new forms, for example, in the case of cybersecurity, the new kinds of challenges which demand different responses by different kinds of actors, and which may be growing so fast and becoming so powerful that they disrupt what the traditional ideas about security. And I think Fiona's presentation, I don't know if she's still here, but I was very struck by that, which was about climate change. So, of course, we all know that this is an underlying problem which could swamp everything else within the next 20 or 30 years. But it's very important to highlight the differential impact of it on Latin America. So some regions, not everywhere, but for example, if there is a Niña sea effect last year followed by a Niño effect this year, which is what the meteorologists are predicting, and if the climate change continues to accelerate, which it seems to, that's actually as important as the deforestation question in the Amazon, because that results in tremendous floods in some places, tremendous droughts in somewhere else. It disrupts the agricultural economy, and it throws all kinds of new security risks into effect. Some of them could indeed be refugee flows caused by climate disasters. Now that's it's a geopolitical. People think of refugees as fleeing political repression. And of course, most Venezuelans who have left Venezuela are fleeing for that kind of reason. But there's also a huge amount of flows and potentially uncontrollable greater flows, which can be driven by environmental disasters. By the way, climate change is a nice, simple thing, the idea of the temperature rising. But in fact, it compounds with all kinds of other effects, such as, in Latin America, it is a region very prone to earthquakes, for example. There are natural hurricanes, which are partly perhaps climate change, but in any case, hurricanes in the Caribbean are much more serious when the population gets denser and when you are forced to build houses in locations which are more and more vulnerable because of scarcity. So there are a whole series of long-run adverse tendencies, and as I think Fiona said, on the one hand, Latin America has many of the highest risk communities from that point of view. On the other hand, it also has some adaptability capacities, and it has the potential that is not just regional but global. It has very high proportions of the copper you need, the lithium you need, and by the way, it's the marginal supplier of food for international trade. So food security is another, which is not just a Latin American problem, it's a global problem made much worse by Ukraine. So there's an interaction between different dimensions of security here. And I think that the conference did a good job of couldn't integrate them all, of course, but touching on the fact that security is a very multifaceted problem and that it's growing. I think the other point that I'd just highlight from the panels that we've had, and I think it was particularly the last panel, Latin America, we talk about Latin America in a very global way, as if we all agreed what we're talking about. And then we have a speaker from Argentina, a speaker from Chile, a speaker from Mexico, and so on. So that seems to cover it. But the heterogeneity of the Latin American region, and also clarity about which parts of Latin America you're actually focusing on. Normally in the word is LAC, Latin America and the Caribbean. Then you get 33 countries, not 20 countries. You get a number of Anglophone independent countries, and you get, as it was also mentioned, 10 UK dependencies. They're very small, but very relevant as far as what British policy. Britain's going to be forced to attend to those problems, and it's going to be judged in the region by how well it handles the areas of principal responsibility of itself. So, and by the way, in the same spirit, I've always said Latin America includes Puerto Rico. This is not something that is universally recognized, and I'm not making a political point here. I'm saying there are many of the things, like hurricanes, which are, you need to think of Puerto Rico as part of the collective Latin American experience. And in fact, I was hearing, because they're talking about the Royal Navy in the Caribbean, I think, and the collaboration with the US Customs and so on, that, of course, Latin America includes French Guiana, not a part of the European Union, I would remind you. It votes in the French general election, and Martinique and Guadeloupe, and it includes the Dutch island of Curaçao. So we are actually, we need to be clear when we're talking about Latin America, we're talking about an extremely large subcontinent with a great deal of internal diversity. Some institutions which embrace all of that, and some collective statements that can be made about the whole of and encompassing Latin America, but also a tremendous alphabet soup of different collaborative organizations which intersect and compete with one another and represent Mercosur, the Andean group, the Central American common market, CARICOM, and so it goes on. So that we need to think in terms of the instrumentalities that are available on particular security problems in particular sub-regions. And I think that was latent, not perhaps brought out as explicitly as I have, but latent in quite a bit of the discussion we've had.
I mean, perhaps I can put you a bit on the spot on that very issue, because I think what we obviously want to do is to take today's conversation, as I say, and perhaps drill down into some of them over the next year. Think about what we should be prioritising when we gather again in 12 months' time. You've described, I think, a very broad concept of security that goes from sort of defence, geopolitics, to organised crime, to climate change, environmental issues. Also a very sort of heterogeneous region, very large region, many different countries. They're interlinked internally with their neighbours, but also to the international system. Within all of that, where would you say are the priorities now? What should we be really looking at, I think, in the next 12 months to advance what we've been talking about today and to kind of build the agenda, I guess, to try and address some of the top questions?
Yes, I think there are so many different regions and sub-regions and so many different dimensions of it that you do really, and great institution though you are, you need, with limited resources, to focus on priorities that are manageable. And if you're taking a short-term time horizon, like the next 12 months for study, not really expecting to produce results, but to observe. Well, I believe that what Annette was talking about concerning the peace process in Colombia is a very highly, and its interactions with Venezuela, both, let's call that region Gran Colombia, which is, after all, where most of the refugees are coming from. It's where the greatest peace challenges persist. And incidentally, they happen to have a substantial chunk of the Amazon, which they also, not only Brazil, need to manage well. So I would say that one theme worth focusing on, because it's going to be so pressing, and because also, honestly, US policy towards Venezuela and Colombia hasn't been a great success, and it's not guaranteed that it's going to be stable. In a year's time, the US may change its policy again. So an influence from, or an analytical stance, followed by British influence perhaps, attempting to look in a constructive, broad way, and in alliance, not just Britain on its own, but there are other players such as the Norwegians are playing a really out of proportion role in trying to be helpful and in studying specific aspects. So that would be one example, but I don't want to limit it to a single region. What has just happened in the last few weeks in Brasilia, first of all, and then in Lima, tells us that you've got to be on the alert for flashpoints, which really force, they may actually accelerate constructive response, because now the world is looking at Lima, and I think it ought to be seeing that the Peruvians are in a terrible mess which they can't sort out on their own, and that if there isn't intelligent and coordinated support and understanding from outside, that can not only get much worse in Peru, but can be destabilizing for Ecuador, for Bolivia, even. It has resonances that are dangerous even for Brazil. So I would say Peru would be another, and perhaps if you wanted a third area that I would say is particularly high profile and is going to be a big issue. We've had some discussion about the drug cartels and the evolving nature of international crime, which is partly in Colombia, but is also very, very accelerated in Mexico and Central America, and which is perhaps demanding special attention, because of the transformative effect it has on the United States, and because it can inflame polarized domestic opinion in the United States in such a way that the United States fails to play the constructive role that's needed on its own, whereas perhaps friends of the United States who are not so directly involved could make a contribution.
I mean, the one thing I also wanted to pick up on is, as someone who's engaged with Latin America for many years with a UK perspective, you're running through today's discussions, but also the work that we want to do is to improve that relationship, but reflecting RUSI's traditional approach, which is to look at security and defense, but in a positive way, as a basis for sort of coming together. I think in the last panel that there was a discussion really about the reciprocity in the relationship, how to develop that. Sometimes in our relationship, security has been an issue, sort of a problem in the bilateral relations, but it could also be a stimulus for more positive engagements. At least part of the growing interest, perhaps in Latin America, is the geopolitical context that's coming, and that we saw during the Cold War that can be also a stimulus for less than desirable engagements between the Western community and Latin America. Do you have any thoughts really about how the UK can engage on this security agenda? I mean, I think you spoke very eloquently about universities, but are there other aspects you think that may be relevant here for us to think about?
I mean, the minister said that he'd been in the UN Security Council and that he'd been in Britain as a permanent member of the Security Council, cannot on his own do anything, but in conjunction with other members of the Security Council, which is problematic because the Russians will veto everything now, and the Chinese are no longer so likely to go along. But nevertheless, there is, on some of these issues, if an intelligent and constructive approach is taken, which is not too confrontational, not too Anglo-Saxon hegemonic, shall we say, and which has genuine support within Latin America, there is scope for better international policies, partly through the UN. And I would suggest that thinking about that, our relationship and our partnership and similarity of outlook with Canada is very important here, because the Canadians actually play an active and significant role, for example, in the Colombian issue and in relation to Venezuela and so on. And if we are working with the Canadians, it's a bit more reassuring than if we are seen as, to be perfectly honest, Latin Americans did see us as simply going along with the United States over Iraq, for example, at a point where it was the Chileans and the Mexicans on the Security Council who refused to accept the arguments that were made for the invasion of Iraq. So there is that friction, and remember that Lula has just become president of Brazil. López Obrador, whether you like him or not, López Obrador's attitudes are quite prickly and nationalist, and he's not going to take kindly to us appearing to be knowing better than the Latin Americans what's good for Latin America. So it's got to be done carefully. It's got to be done with a broad base. It's got to be done with solid research, and but there is scope for constructive work there.
Thanks. Perhaps if I could ask the audience if there's any other reflections on today's discussions, in particular this idea about how we should best move forward and what the priorities might be in addressing this security. Does anyone? Yes. Do you want to get the microphone? Yeah.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you. I think one of the main points in terms of the UK has to do with cocaine consumption. So, as I was doing my PhD here, in a very off-the-record level, I would chat with other students that are younger than I am, fortunately, and they wouldn't know where cocaine comes from. So they would think that cocaine comes from Afghanistan. So that part of the ignorance in terms of where cocaine comes from, and that it can only come from only one region in the world, has to do also with maybe a lack of perspective in terms of consumption and what's happening. So my reflection would be, in order to engage, yes, as Dr. mentioned, it's not about pretending to know more than maybe Latin Americans, but it's the idea that because in the region we are also limited by the Spanish. I mean, it's an advantage, but it's also a deterrent in some cases. When you go in Latin America and you mention you're from whichever country in Latin America and you go to another country, they will embrace you like, hey, brother, sister. But in terms of Latin Americans going abroad, sometimes the fact that everything is in Spanish and then suddenly you need to go and be brave and speak English and, go abroad and study and make some points, it's also a deterrent. And most of the courses and training opportunities in terms of security are mostly in English. The NATO is also a huge commitment, but I think it's only Colombia who is now as an observer inside NATO, even though many countries are in the Atlantic, right? And as a closing comment, I would really share and prize the efforts of the Perry Center, where Fabiana is working, because the Perry Center offers courses in Spanish, considering that most of the region speaks Spanish. So I think that's also a very important option when you want to engage with Latin American countries, to consider the Spanish language. Thank you, and thanks for the event.
Thank you. Any other ones? Yes, all at the back. And just while we're passing the microphone, I would mention that certainly next year what we are intending to do is actually offer a Spanish and Portuguese simultaneous interpretation for the online and in the room. And indeed, we are also, I think one of the things we feel is very important is to start to engage more in translating things published in Latin America on security for English-speaking audiences, which we're doing, but also the other way around. So that, I think that's a really good, excellent point, which we are already trying to prioritise. Yes, I think it was Orla.
Thank you, Orla McBreen from the Embassy of Ireland, and thank you for an excellent event. Something that struck me that's come up from time to time in the panels are the related challenges of cybersecurity and disinformation, and their challenges for democracies in Europe and across Latin America, and not just disinformation from maybe state sources or close to state sources, but from criminal gangs, from certain businesses maybe, and it's not just undermining national governments, democratic institutions at local level. It's particularly targeted at human rights defenders, environmental defenders, those working on women's rights, and it's a shared challenge. So rather than a pupils teachers approach, is there space for shared lesson sharing or strategies between European countries, including of course the UK, and Latin American countries? Thank you.
Thanks.
Can I just comment on both? I mean, there's the two speakers. A key aspect is co-responsibility. That it's not, we mustn't approach it with a paternalistic mindset, but rather a recognition that these are shared problems, and that some of the things that we can learn from Latin America as well as the other way around. Some of the problems they're grappling with, if they come up with suitable solutions, we should learn from them. And in some cases, we are a part of the source of the problem, and we need to review our own, as a contribution to helping them. It should include that we help ourselves by correcting mistakes and policy slippages. So I think that links those two comments together.
Right. I think we have time just one or two more, so I think the gentleman here and then just down here.
Thank you very much. Just one point that I think we didn't touch today, and can be quite relevant and important as well when we look at Latin America. It's exactly outside Latin America, it's African continent. The relations between Latin American and African countries are quite relevant, and many of the issues that especially the west coast of Africa face today in terms of security, and especially maritime security, has also an impact for South Atlantic in general. And as a Brazilian in particular, I would like to mention that aspect, and the increasing of piracy in Gulf of Guinea, and the amount of maritime traffic in the coast of Africa, when we saw the Suez Canal closed for 1 week, then the maritime traffic move around again to the old route from around in Africa, that implies also in many security risks for the region in general, not only in terms of piracy, but as well as environmental security for the oceans in this region, and the submarine cables that connect Europe to Brazil and to Latin America in general in terms of communication. So I think we should not forget that when we talk about Latin America, and again, as a Brazilian and South American perspective, we cannot neglect the relationship and the impacts that a cooperation or not with African countries can have for the impact of security in the region. Thank you.
Gentleman here.
Hi, thank you. Owais Rajput, a Defense and Security Studies researcher from Bradford. What I learned here today, I think we really need to learn about our diaspora communities in UK, and then transnational connections. That is a good start. Because I can give you one example. I've spoken with you as well when you're sitting next to me. Right now, fair enough, we're talking about Russians, but for me, now Chinese, they are the global threat. Because Chinese also doing the same stuff in Southern America, and they're trying to UK, when we have the GB, global, want to go in globe, they want to stop us to enter in Asia, especially their countries where they are actually supporting them, Pakistan or Kashmir, who actually Pakistani controlled areas. And I was victimized myself as well, because we have 3 million British citizens from Kashmir heritage living in UK. There are a lot of similarities, and similarities between Southern America, Chinese, they're also using the same strategy, investing in the trade. And in Pakistan, they're investing in CPAC, which again, their future, the aims are just what I understand, holding us. Yeah.
So the Chinese interdependency, I think that's another one. And then perhaps just because we're running out of time a little bit, one final one here, and then perhaps, Laurence, if you had any closing remarks.
Hi, thanks very much. So just very quickly, I think that, given that it's a Latin America Security Conference, I think that one topic that was missing and that we didn't elaborate on is the security and political crisis in Haiti. And of course, how, from a kind of security risk perspective for the region, it has fairly marginal effects. It's pretty much a domestic type of crisis, but I think that it also provides a very good opportunity and platform for engagement of great powers, whereas that is the French, of course the UK has a strong presence in the Caribbean as well, and there are stakes for both Canada and the US as well. So I think it's a good kind of opportunity for engagement in the region, and just wanted to get your thoughts on how likely that is to lead to some sort of concerted effort to improve the crisis there.
So, I mean, I was tempted to include it when I said Colombia and Grand Colombians. I was tempted to add in Haiti, but as you say, it is a very special set of problems. It's a very acute set of security problems, and it's well worth bearing it in mind, and perhaps you should include it. But one of the things I would say is that the Haitian people are in a very sad state, and they are extremely disenchanted with previous efforts to intervene in their affairs. And it is therefore not at all clear that there is, those who might want to be helpful are saying to themselves, but is there any local potential and capacity we can connect with that would really work? And I'm afraid that is a big question mark over that particular one. Of course, the lesson that implies more generally is if you let, for example, the crisis in Colombia or the crisis in Peru get bad enough, you'll find that there won't be anybody you can work with there either. So it's an argument for preventive, anticipating rather than letting the situation degenerate. There is another security question which, it's been absolutely in everybody's minds in Latin American studies over the last 2 years, and we haven't mentioned it. And I think it hasn't completely gone away, which is the pandemic. And this is actually an area where the Latin Americans have great capacities. They've suffered tremendously from COVID in different forms. Not everybody's suffered, but some of the policies have been successful. Many of them have been terribly unsuccessful. But they have actually a great deal, and co-responsibility is clearly necessary. They didn't cause COVID, it came to them. But they also have a capacity, medical, pharmaceutical production and health service capacities and so on, which are, important and substantial. And there's a variety, again, of responses to COVID. And I think that is another theme, perhaps a little bit compartmentalized from the ones that are most concerned to you, but it is a security matter of great sensitivity for a lot of people in Latin America, and it does have a multilateral solution to it. It has the kind of solution that the British can play an active and prominent role in, and if it isn't handled well, it can get worse again.
Great. Well, thanks very much. I think we've unfortunately run out of time. Just before I hand over to my colleague, Carlos Solar, on whose very wide shoulders actually implementing all this agenda is going to depend over the next year, I would like to thank Laurence Whitehead for sharing his views with us. As I say, it's been really a privilege to have you on our panel, and thank you so much for coming today for our conference. So.
Yes.
So these are my closing remarks, which are literally just 30 seconds. I can see that you all want to go home. This really felt like binge watching your favorite Netflix series, but on Latin American studies. I think we are all living, wanting the second season of this, right? So I'm really thankful for my colleagues at RUSI who helped me organize this, and those that acted as chairs and came to the audience. I'm really thankful for the speakers that traveled from abroad and those that came from different parts of the UK to actually be with us today. I'm really thankful to the contribution of FCDO, the MOD, and the Armed Forces for getting the minister and for working with us. And we're looking forward to be working with you for the next rounds of this conference. And the audience, of course, of students, NGOs, diplomats, the military attaches, and the private sector that were here with us. I think we'll all leave with more questions than answers, but let's look for year 2 of this really particular and insightful event. So thank you very much, and I wish you a good trip home. Thank you.